Today we're going to start our study on 20th century music. We will start with the styles of the 20th century, then move on to Impressionism and the two composers Debussy and Ravel.
The 20th century was an extraordinary time. If you look on page 357, you will read that there were extremes of violence and progress during the 20th century. And during this time, there was 2 world wars, which there was an unleashing of new weapons with unprecedented destructive force. And between the wars, there was dictatorship and global depression that caused massive hardships. At the same time, there was rapid economic growth, propelling prosperity for many, and the principle of equal rights gained ground. There was also extraordinary acceleration in technology and science, where the Wright brothers made the first powered flight, and then 66 years later, humans were walking on the moon. And there's a flood of new technologies, including sound recordings, movies, radio, satellites, computers, and the internet. They triggered a continuous revolution in communications. And so that has a strong influence on music during the 20th century, and we're going to see how those two connect to one another. During the 20th century, composers were attracted to unconventional rhythms and sounds and melodic patterns. They were using a lot more sound effects and lots of different varieties of new instruments that had new sounds, and rhythms were really difficult and much more intricate than ever before. American jazz had an influence on many composers, and we're going to talk about jazz and how it started in the New Orleans area and moved north and then throughout the world. Percussion instruments are more prominent. In other words, in the orchestra, you're going to have a lot of percussion instruments, and they're going to play a more dominant role in the orchestra. And you might have just percussion ensembles where just percussion are playing. And so they are much more prominent. And for an example, if you're just to hear a rock band, they're almost always going to have a drummer playing along. They may not have all the other instruments, but they're going to have a drummer keeping the beat and then a guitar and a keyboard or something. And the piano is often treated as a percussion instrument, especially when it's put in the orchestra. Now it's not only used as a solo instrument, but it can be put towards the back of the orchestra and used as a percussion instrument. Since the hammers actually strike the string, it is in fact a percussion instrument. And so it was used as a percussion instrument in the orchestra. Chords are becoming more and more dissonant. In other words, they clash with one another much more than they have in the past. And they create more of a feeling of instability. Sometimes 2 chords are played at the same time, and this is called a polychord. So here's an example. I will play 2 separate major chords, and then I will play them together. That's one major chord, second major chord, and that's that's when they're played together. All right. At other times, the notes in the chord might only be a half step apart or whole steps apart, and those created tone clusters. So here's an example. I will play the chromatic scale in half steps and then play the cluster chord of half steps. Then I'll play the whole tone scale, and then I'll play the whole tone chord cluster. So here's that. Chromatic scale, cluster chord. Whole tone scale, cluster chord. Of course, to me, the whole tone cluster chord is much more nice to the ear than the half step cluster chord, but both were used to create instability and so that you didn't really feel a tone center anymore. The church modes were revived, so they were no longer interested in just using major and minor, but there were actually 8 different church modes that used different whole step and half step patterns than the major and minor scale. So they started using those so that music sounded again different than the major and minor that they'd been hearing for the last 200 years. New scales were also invented. You had blues scales, chromatic scales, pentatonic scales, which meant they only had 5 notes, and whole tone scales, which are scales built on whole step. Sometimes the composers used more than one key at a time. So this would be called polytonal, which is like many tones, or bitonal, which is like 2 tones. And so they would have the left hand be in one key and the right hand might be in a different key. At other times, there was not a tonal center at all, and that was called a tonality. That means there was no center, there was no rhyme or reason in the notes. They just were, that's just a tonality. There's no tonal center at all. There was also a 12-tone system, which kept all 12 notes in the same order, either separately or together. And so they would build a 12-tone row, and then they could do it forwards, and they could do it backwards, and they could do it inverted, but they had to always keep them in the same order. And so they would build songs that way. And you could play the chords or the tones together, but you couldn't use tone 7 until you had used tone 6 either individually or in a group. Let's listen to some of the examples of what I was just talking about. First of all, we're going to hear one of the church modes. This is called the Dorian scale, and it will sound different than the others. Here's a blues scale. Here's a pentatonic scale. Only 5 notes. Whole tone scale. Here is Mary Had a Little Lamb in one key. Here's Mary Had a Little Lamb in a second key. Here are the 2 keys together. And if I want to do polytonal, I could actually add a 3rd key. And all together. And here's an example of the chromatic scale, where everything is moving by half step. So all these new scales just opened up a whole new plethora of ideas and abilities to put notes together in new ways. If you look on page 367 at the top, you'll see Stravinsky's Ritual of Abduction from the Rite of Spring. It includes a lot of meter changes, and that is what is happening a lot of times in 20th century music. Rhythm often includes frequent meter changes. So here's what this would sound like. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And some composers also used unconventional meters. So you'll see this 3 plus 3 plus 2 over 8 in the middle of page 367. That just means you've got a group of 3, 3, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 3, 2. And here's what that would sound like. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Still others use 2 different meters at the same time. This is more common in orchestral music, where you might have the clarinets in 2/4 and the violins in 3/4. And so the meters were different. Sometimes that would even happen in piano music, but more frequently in orchestra music. Ostinatos were also used. This is a repeated motive or phrase that's played at the same pitch throughout the section in the piece. So here's an example of an ostinato, and then I'll play a little melody with the ostinato. That's the repeated pattern and the melody. And melody also has many more leaps, and they're much more difficult to sing and play because there's intervals of sevenths and ninths and twelfths, and not just your seconds and thirds where melody has moved more frequently in the past. Now they have bigger leaps, which makes it much more difficult to sing and play. Impressionistic art also had a huge influence on music during this same time period. This is the very beginning of the 20th century. Impressionistic artwork had tiny colored patches. When viewed closely, you could see these little tiny dots. But when you looked at it from a distance, they create a form, and so you can see a picture to develop. And so they were obsessed with water and clouds and fog and mist. And so these are two impressionistic paintings that are all made with tiny dots. There's no sweeping strokes made. They're all tiny dots. And then when you look up close, you can see the dots. But when you go far away, you see the picture. Well, that's how they did what they did in music as well. They are creating blurry pictures with the music. In your textbook on page 369 through 370, you can read about impressionistic music and how they talk about composers creating blurry pictures with their music. And the two most important impressionistic composers were Debussy and Ravel. And so we're going to study them at this time. If you look on page 370 to 371, you'll read about Claude Debussy. He was a French composer, and he was born in 1862, and he died in 1918. Debussy was the very first impressionistic composer. He was born in France, near Paris, in 1862, and he started out as a child playing the piano, but later he turned to composition. He loved to write music. And even though the professors at the Paris Conservatory disapproved of his music because he did not follow the rules of composition, so he was sort of like Grieg, where Grieg felt like there was too many restrictions being placed on him as a composer. Debussy was the same way. The professors of the day just said he was breaking all the rules and that they didn't like his music and they were not giving him good grades and good scores and good marks for his music. But when he was 22, he won the Prix de Rome, which is the highest award given to French composers, and it paid for him to study music in Rome for 3 years. Since Debussy's music was so unique and the public was not quite ready for the sounds that he had in his compositions, for many years he earned a living primarily by teaching the piano. But when he was 40, his compositions began to be recognized and he became famous as a composer. This fame and fortune led to financial and emotional troubles, which is unfortunate because he craved luxuries and was constantly borrowing money to get them, and he had affairs and divorces. So this is similar to what Wagner struggled with and Liszt struggled with, and many really famous musicians today struggle with. When they get this fame and fortune, it suddenly throws their life out of balance. And when he was age 50, he died from cancer in Paris, and while Paris was being bombed by Germany during one of the world wars. And so kind of an interesting death. One of the pieces we're going to listen to that was written by Debussy is the Sunken Cathedral. And this is a great example of this impressionistic music. Everything is this blurry sound. And you can read about this on page 372. It says he tends to use chords more for its special color and sensuous quality than for its function and a standard harmonic progression. And he uses successions of dissonant chords that do not resolve. And so you're going to hear this in this piece, The Sunken Cathedral, where we have these just tone clusters that are just creating a picture of a cathedral that is under water. If you look on page 373, all the way through the top of page 375, you'll read about the prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, written by Debussy. This is again musical impressionistic interpretation of a poem by Stephanie Mallarmé. And it's talking about this little fawn. This is the kind of the goat character that has the human body at top and the goat legs and the horns. And if you ever read the Chronicles of Narnia, there were fawns in the Chronicles of Narnia. And this is an impressionistic painting. When you watch this YouTube video, you'll see impressionistic paintings in the background of the video. But the poem evokes the dreams and erotic fantasies of a pagan forest creature who's half man, half goat. While playing a long solo on his flute, the intoxicated faun tries to recall whether he actually carried off two beautiful nymphs or only dreamed of doing so. Exhausted by the effort, he falls back to sleep in the sunshine. And so that is the basic storyline. You hear woodwind solos and muted horn calls and harp glissandos. And you can follow along with the listening guide. It's in the ABA ternary form. And so you can hear this solo flute, the faun playing the flute. Then in the B section, the woodwinds. And you have these big crescendos and string melodies and harps. And then you get the A melody back again with lots of harps and flutes and muted horns and violins. And so it's quite a fun piece and interesting piece to listen to. Although it was not well received the first time it was heard. But as time has gone by, more people really enjoy this piece. Now let's look at some of Debussy's piano music. On page 375 to 376, you will see a diagram of how you can follow along with the music of Sails. The song is called Sails. It's a short piano piece which uses blurred, vague tonality and lots of whole tone scales to suggest the gentle rocking of sails in the wind. And so just a delightful little piece that you can follow along with. And then I also included Gollywog's Cakewalk because Debussy was influenced by this new American style of music called jazz. And Gollywog's Cakewalk incorporates this new jazz sound in the piano music. So I hope you enjoy listening to both of these selections. On page 376 through 379, you will read about Maurice Ravel and about one of his pieces called Bolero. Ravel was born in 1875 and he died in 1937. And like Debussy, he grew up in Paris and was influenced by all of the artists that were living in Paris. And he is the only other highly recognized impressionistic composer. Impressionism only lasted a short time before we were propelled into the new music of the 20th century, which was largely affected by the world wars and all of the catastrophic destruction and death that happened during this time after the Impressionistic era. He was a composer who orchestrated Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition. So when we listened to Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, the orchestrated version, this was done by Ravel because Mussorgsky only wrote it for piano and Ravel found the pieces and thought, oh, this would be a great piece to orchestrate, so he did that. Many of his pieces, many of his works have a Spanish flavor. And in the piece that we'll listen to, Bolero, it has a Spanish flavor to it. It has Spanish influences. And he was also highly influenced by jazz and blues. He loved that new American music sound, and so he incorporated that into his pieces. And he was fascinated by dance music, especially ballets. And so we're going to listen to Bolero next, which incorporates a lot of these things. Bolero was written by Ravel in 1928. It is one of the best known of all orchestral works, and it reflects Ravel's fascination with tone color, Spanish music, rhythmic repetition, and it was also originally a ballet. So all the things he really loved were all incorporated into this song. Ravel described Bolero as an experiment consisting of one long, very gradual crescendo. And to me, it's kind of like an ostinato that goes over and over and over again and gradually gets louder and keeps adding more and more instruments. And so you start out with solo woodwind instruments, including an unusual oboe d'amour, which is the oboe of love, which is lower than the oboe, but higher than the English horn. And the volume gradually increases. Brass instruments and tenor and saxophone, sopranino saxophones, rare in the symphony orchestra, are used, and they are given the theme, and there's novel tone colors result from unusual doublings such as muted trumpets and flutes. And then again, you can look on page 378 and 379, and you'll see this bum ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, bum bum ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-bum, and that is this repeated ostinato rhythmic pattern that goes on throughout the piece. And you can follow that it's kind of like a theme and variation, and there's 5 big sections that you can see here. And the whole piece is quite long. It actually lasts about 14 minutes, and each part of the song adds more and more instruments and gets louder and louder and louder. And it has this repeated rhythms and new tone colors that are added as you add new instruments and new ways to play the instruments. And then you have the ballet that originally went with it.
Be sure to read pages 355 through 379 so you can have a better idea about the 20th century music and Impressionism, Debussy, and Ravel, and listen to all of the excerpts.